everyone. This is a pilot episode of the podcast A Voice from Russia. My name is Ekaterina Mashonkina, or Kate Mosh for short. I am a Russian opposition activist working in Alexei Navalny's team. This podcast, however, is my personal initiative. I decided to make it as a part of the fundraising campaign in order to raise money for my education. This year I got admitted to Master of Public Policy at the University of Berkeley. I wasn't awarded any scholarship and spent most of the summer searching for alternative sources of funding. Well, since I'm recording this podcast, you might guess that my search for alternative funding hasn't been successful. Fundraising is my ultimate resort, and here I am, finally venturing to start it. I decided it would be unfair to ask for any donations without giving anything in return. So my offer to you is this podcast about current events in Russia as they are perceived by me, an opposition activist who witnesses all that's going on and actually participates in everything. I believe this is enough of an intro. Let's start the podcast itself. So what is it all about, and how did it happen that elections to Moscow City Parliament resulted in thousands of people taken to the streets? Let's start from the very beginning. Moscow City Parliament is elected for 5 years and comprises 45 deputies, each deputy being elected in one of the districts. Out of those 45 deputies, 28 represent the United Russia Party, the ruling party, and 10 the so-called independent movement My Moscow, which is in fact a pro-government structure too. So basically 38 out of 45 seats belong to pro-government forces, while the rest 7 are occupied by the so-called systemic, meaning loyal to the authorities, opposition. Last year, Alexei Navalny announced a huge new project called the Smart Vote. The idea of the project is to consolidate the votes within each district so that people who don't want to vote for a United Russia representative vote for someone else altogether without dispersing, without spreading their votes in support of, let's say, 5 or 6 different candidates. For this project, Navalny's organization, the Anti-Corruption Foundation, chose 2 of its members as potential candidates. Lyubov Sobol, an ex-lawyer, now the producer of Navalny Live YouTube channel, and Ivan Zhdanov, the current director of the foundation. Another 3 candidates who joined the team promoted by Navalny, Yashin, Milov, and Yankauskas, are independent activists and politicians who just support Navalny movement in general, and he in his turn supports them. So these 5 candidates cover only 5 districts, but there are more independent candidates from other districts who have also been involved in this or that kind of oppositional activity and who also started their campaigns. If a candidate is not nominated by any party, he or she is supposed to gather signatures of 5% of the district population in order to be registered for the elections. So each of the independent candidates had to collect around 5,000 or 6,000 signatures depending on the district. Now, what does a signature actually mean? Signatures are collected manually on special sheets of paper. One signature is one line, and each line has several columns. Basically, they contain full name, passport number, permanent registration address, and then the signature itself and the date. The rules for filling this are first of all close to innumerable and secondly very, very strict. For example, no contracted forms are allowed. You cannot write Lenin STR dot. You need to write Lenin Street. You cannot write just Moscow. You need to write City of Moscow, etc. All the fields apart from signature and date are filled by a special person, a signature collector, while the signature and the date should be written by the person himself, by the voter himself. Independent candidates had less than 30 days to collect the required amount of signatures, but a short period of signature collection is only the tip of the iceberg. To have a better understanding of how complex the task of signature collection is, let's for a moment put ourselves in signature collectors' shoes. So you go out there in your district talking to people in the streets and doing door-to-door. First of all, this is July, the middle of summer, and many people have left for vacation. Secondly, even though Moscow is very densely populated in comparison to other Russian cities, a huge part of the population here doesn't have permanent registration in Moscow. They come from other regions to study, then start working, rent apartments, but never actually bother to change their registration. Take me as an example. I've lived in Moscow since 2014 and I'm still registered in my native city. But even if someone is physically in Moscow and is registered at a Moscow address, people might not be willing to open the door. If you're waiting for some visitor, you know about it and you will open, but if not, why open it to a stranger? If someone finally opens the door to you, this person might refuse to sign because he or she just doesn't care. Bear in mind, the majority of the population here is apolitical. But even if someone opens the door to you, they might be scared of providing their personal information, especially knowing that all this data will go straight to the authorities at the stage when the signatures are checked. Well, I hope this is enough to prove the task of signature collection to be almost insurmountable. Yet, almost all the independent candidates managed to do it and submitted the required amount of signatures in due time. So, we have spoken about the challenges a signature collector faces. Now, let's talk about the adventures of a signature. What can actually happen to a perfectly valid, perfectly written signature for it to become crossed out of the list and disqualified? The process of signature examination includes checking the conformance of signature sheets to general rules of how they should be filled, comparing the information in the signature sheets against the database of passports, and examining the signatures by handwriting experts. Now let me give you examples for each of these stages, what can be considered wrong, and what causes signatures to be disqualified. Speaking of general check, if a signature collector makes a mistake while certifying the signature sheet, like forgets to indicate his date of birth or misspells something, the whole signature sheet is disqualified. Then, comparing against the passport database is the most amazing part. The Electoral Committee turns the handwritten text into digital format and then makes machine comparison of the data against the database they have. Some candidates noticed that while transferring passport numbers into the Excel sheet, the operators forgot to change the cell format. So all the zeros at the beginning of passport numbers were just dropped. After the automated comparison, all the signatures were disqualified because the passports without zero in their numbers didn't match the ones in the database which are correct and have zeros in their numbers. And this is only one example of a human error. A lot of misprints by the operators also have been observed by the candidates. As for handwriting experts, the violation they most often refer to is that the date was not written by the same hand as the signature. So having looked at the adventures of a signature collector and of a signature itself, let's get down to adventures of potential candidates and general public. That's a far more vivid part. Adventures of potential candidates have a clear structure and chronological order. They are divided in 3 stages: District Electoral Committee, Moscow City Electoral Committee as the first point of appeal, and Central Electoral Committee as the second and final point of appeal. At each stage, there is a task force session where the subject matter of the case is supposed to be discussed. Then, each task force session is followed by a corresponding committee session. The district electoral committees made the first decision to disqualify the candidates. The candidates had 2 days between the task force and the district committee session to prepare their objections. So they did that. For many cases, when this or that signature was deemed invalid, they either pointed to the mistakes made during the automated check, or provided written objections of the voters, or even videos of the voters who admitted that they did put the signature, or actually brought the voters to the committee session as witnesses. So what do you think? None. None of this was taken into consideration, and all the independent candidates were refused registration. That is why one of the slogans all this time has been I am, we are, meaning I do exist, we do exist. Both celebrities who gave their signature to this or that candidate and regular citizens were outraged by the fact that the bureaucratic machine with its rules basically denied their existence, even though they were willing to confirm it. The teams of the candidates unfolded a whole infrastructure both online and offline to find the people who submitted their signatures and get the confirmation from them. But all in vain. The authorities just won't listen. Sorry, I'm getting emotional here, but that's how Moscow people felt. How they do feel now, and that is why they are willing to protest. Let's come back to the way events unfolded. Following the district committee session, one of the candidates, Lyubov Sobol, went on a hunger strike. Mind you, this was July the 13th, and this lady is still on strike. I'm recording this on the 1st of August. On the following day, July the 14th, the candidates announced a public meeting with the electorate in Tverskaya Street. From there, the crowd proceeded along Tverskaya to the City Hall and then to the building of Moscow Electoral Committee, the next point of appeal for the candidates after the District Electoral Committee. After spending there several hours chanting slogans and demanding a meeting with the head of Moscow Electoral Committee, Mr. Gorbanov, candidates announced a sit-down strike right in the yard of the committee. When by the late evening around 100 people remained there, some activists started to put up tents for the night. The police came into play and dispersed the crowd, detaining 40 people, including the candidates.
Это наш город!
On July the 20th, opposition managed to organize a large rally in Sakharov Avenue. The permit for that had been obtained well in advance by the Libertarian Party. The estimates differ, but the most realistic number is 25,000 participants, which for Moscow is a record since the protests of 2012. At this rally, Alexei Navalny suggested a peaceful compromise to the authorities. Either you register everyone within 1 week, or we will go to the City Hall on the upcoming Saturday, July the 27th. On the 23rd of July, the head of Central Electoral Committee, Ella Pamfilova, had a meeting with the unregistered candidates. The meeting lasted for several hours. The candidates heard a lot of promises. For an inexperienced viewer, it might have seemed productive and promising, but no real deal was reached, and the events that followed clearly showed that it was nothing more than a masquerade. Right on the following morning, Navalny was arrested during his morning jog for calling for an unsanctioned rally next to the City Hall building. Apart from Navalny, the head of Moscow Navalny office was arrested too. But the icing on the cake was a criminal case initiated by the investigative committee. Remember when the crowd went to the Moscow Electoral Committee and the candidates demanded to meet the head of it during a sit-down strike? That was Sunday. The building was closed. The head of the committee was officially reported to be out of the city, but none of this prevented the investigative committee from starting the criminal case on, attention here, on obstructing the operation of the electoral committee. And what does a criminal case mean? It means that the investigators can raid apartments, can conduct interrogations, can assign a status of a witness to anyone who was present there. And then, if need be, the status of a witness can turn into the status of a suspect in a snap. Once the case was initiated, the raids and interrogations started. The investigators came to several candidates with a night raid, which is illegal, and interrogated several people on that night and the following day. These were not only candidates, but also the staff of the Anti-Corruption Foundation. After that, the sessions of Moscow City Electoral Committee took place, where the initial refusal to register the candidates was confirmed in the appeal. Lyubov Sobol, the candidate on hunger strike, announced that she would continue her strike right in the building of the committee. Late at night, local guards took the sofa she was sitting on out of the building into the yard, together with Miss Sobol on it. Several minutes later, she was detained and taken to the police station again. The part I like best about the sofa episode is that next morning a representative of the electoral committee gave an official announcement stating that the guards took the sofa to give it a shake outdoors so as to remove parasites and bedbugs. End of quote. Believe me, I'm not exaggerating, I have a degree in translation. That's what an official representative of Moscow Electoral Committee said. Probably most of you have heard about the mass protest on the 27th of July. As suggested by Navalny, people wanted to gather outside the city hall for a peaceful protest demanding registration of independent candidates. This amount of forces drawn to the city center had never been seen before. The police, the National Guard troops. They started to detain people 2 hours before the official start of the event. They detained a guy who was just jogging along Tverskaya and broke his leg while capturing him. By 2 p.m., most of the candidates had already been detained or taken to interrogation. They were not able to participate in the rally. When thousands of people were trying to approach the city hall, the police divided the crowd into several groups, pushing them into the adjacent side streets. At that moment, I was in Brusov Pereulok, a side street right next to the city hall. What I saw were several rows of troops dressed in full protective gear with helmets and batons. You know, in Russia we call them cosmonauts for such outfit. There was not just a row, a single chain of cosmonauts, but many of them, like 5 rows, moving onto the crowd, trying to push it further away from Tverskaya. Sometimes they pulled someone from the crowd to detain them and beat them heavily. The girls screamed. Then everyone stopped for a while and the protesters continued to chant their slogans. One of the most popular ones this time was «Мы без оружия», meaning we do not have weapon, as opposed to the troops who were armed to the teeth. But in a few minutes the troops started to push again, and it all repeated several times. That is how slowly everyone was squeezed out of the side street. Similar confrontations took place in several points of the city. Some of them were more fierce, with the police beating up protesters badly. At a certain point, there were several marches around the city center at the same time. In some locations, people started walking on the traffic area of the street, and one of the crowds even blocked the garden ring for several minutes before the buses with National Guard troops dispersed it. In the meantime, the police also attacked studios of the 2 channels who were doing the broadcast. They came to TV Rain channel and took their editor-in-chief to a police station. And they just broke into the studio of Navalny Live YouTube channel, cutting the broadcast, confiscating the equipment from both the channel studio and the Anti-Corruption Foundation office, as well as detaining Vladimir Milov, the presenter of the broadcast. Later, he got 30 days of administrative arrest for organizing the protests with the means of the broadcast. By around 6 p.m., the detained candidates were released from the police stations and called for everyone to come to Trubная Square at 8 p.m. One needs to understand that Trubная Square is a rather small piece of land at the beginning of a boulevard, so it was easily surrounded by the police. Through the loudspeakers, they ran an announcement stating that Moscow police was doing everything to secure our safety, and were asking to leave the square.
Продолжаются призывы к участию в массовом мероприятии в центре столицы. Сообщаем, что в органы государственной власти города уведомлений о согласовании публичного мероприятия не поступало. Московская полиция официально предупреждает, что запланированное на Тверской улице несогласованное мероприятие незаконно.
In the meantime, policemen were carrying every other protester to large police vans, and when someone asked them how they could leave the square, the answer was through the police van. Oh yes, I almost forgot about the candidates. All those who were released several hours before were detained again, either at Trubne Square or the next morning. The detained candidates faced court hearings on the days following the protest and got arrested. The rest of the candidates, along with other oppositional forces, tried to negotiate with the city administration a proper location for the protests announced for the next Saturday, the 3rd of August. The request for official permit to rally was filed by the leader of the Libertarian Party, Mikhail Svetov. When the opposition refused to hold the rally at the location offered by the city administration, Svetov was invited to a set of negotiations. At this meeting, he was basically told to agree to the location offered by the administration. It was the same Sakharov Avenue as a couple of weeks ago, but the protesters and the opposition were not willing to agree to a rally in a location remote from the city center, especially after a violent crackdown on the protest from the police. After Svetov refused, he left the building and was detained right at the exit. He was arrested afterwards too. Later that day, Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin, in his interview to one of the TV channels, named the protest a violent civil unrest. He also thanked the police and National Guard troops for a good job and warned the listeners of upcoming provocations the following Saturday. Right after that, the investigative committee initiated yet another criminal process on violent civil unrest. Basically, that means that any of the participants may face charges with arrests of up to 8 or even 15 years. Apart from that, 2 protesters faced individual criminal charges for the use of force against the police officers. One of these guys threw a trash bin towards a police officer that merely reached him, touching the policeman's heel only. The other guy gave a policeman a mild slap in the face. Now both guys face the charges of up to 5 years of arrest. So let me give you the bottom line numbers as of now. The protest on the 27th of July resulted in 1,373 people being detained. The majority were released at night, but they would have to appear in court and would be charged with an administrative offense resulting in a fine or an arrest of up to 30 days. 77 people suffered injuries. 5 participants of the protest were detained with relation to the criminal case on violent civil unrest. 2 protesters were detained with relation to criminal case on using force against police officers. The leaders of the protest got the following charges: Navalny, Gudkov, Svetov, Milov, 30 days of arrest each. Zhdanov, 15 days of arrest. Yashin, Galamina, Korovin, 10 days of arrest each. Stepanov, Solovyov, 8 days of arrest each. Kinkauskas, 7 days of arrest. Lyubov Sobol, one of the most popular unregistered candidates, has been on a hunger strike since the 13th of July. She hasn't been put under administrative arrest due to having a 5-year-old daughter. However, she has a witness status in the criminal case on obstructing the operation of the Electoral Committee and might face criminal charges later. That's the status quo on the eve of the next protest day and the next set of appeals. Now, in the final point of appeal, the Central Electoral Committee. I hope I haven't bored you. I hope you haven't got lost in all these details and the dense sequence of events. Also, I do hope you would not consider me a crazy selfish girl who decided to make some cash on this media hype around protests in Russia. To some extent it is true, but basically my motivation was the following. If I start an international crowdfunding campaign, what could I offer to the English-speaking audience? Well, I have background in linguistics, so my English, though not perfect, allows me to communicate things in a clear way. And then I'm here in Russia. I see everything from within, so why not share this information so that people who are actually willing to understand the situation can have a bigger picture? Apart from that, as the slogan to this podcast goes, "'Cause the world should know." Because I do believe that the world should know more about the injustice that takes place in Russia and should pay more attention to that. The media provides some coverage, but when such things happen, one cannot have too much information. It all has its value. If you do like this podcast and are ready to support me in my fundraising for master's studies at Berkeley, please go to gofundme.com, search for the campaign named A Voice from Russia, and make your contribution. On the campaign page, you can also read more about myself as well as follow the links to join the project accounts and social networks. Thanks for joining me in this experiment. Stay tuned and listen to A Voice from Russia.